Let's begin Class 2 with a prayer in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. I'd like to read to you St. Francis's Canticle of the Sun prayer. O Most High, Almighty good Lord God, to you belong praise, glory, honor, and all blessing. Praise be, my Lord God, with all creatures, and especially our brother, the sun, which brings us the day and the light. Fair is he, and shining with a very great splendor. O Lord, he signifies you to us. Praise be, my Lord, for our sister the moon, and for the stars, which God has set clearly and lovely in heaven. Praise be, my Lord, for our brother the wind, and for air and cloud, calms and all weather, by which you uphold in life all creatures. Praise be, my Lord, for our sister water, which is very serviceable to us, and humble, precious, and clean. Praise be, my Lord, for brother fire, through which you give us light in the darkness, and he is bright, pleasant, very mighty, and strong. Praise be, my Lord, for our mother the earth, which sustains us and keeps us and yields diverse fruits, flowers of many colors, and grass. Praise be, my Lord, for all those who pardon one another for God's love's sake, and who endure weakness and tribulation. Blessed are they who peaceably shall endure, for you, O Most High, shall give them a crown. Praise be, my Lord, for our sister, the death of the body, from which no one escapes. Woe to him who dies in mortal sin. Blessed are they who are found walking by your most holy will. For the second death, death of the body, and death of the soul, shall have no power to do them harm. Praise you and bless you, the Lord, and give thanks to God, and serve God with great humility. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Amen. You might recall that start of that poem was used by Pope Francis in his encyclical on the environment. And what was not evident in that encyclical was how the poem ends, which is creation is for man. Man is not for creation. We'll explore that theme more in a moment as we go forth in Class 2. I notice some of you that are here today were not here last week, and for those of you who were here last week, you also probably need a recap of Class 1. We were very philosophical last week, you might recall, and I saw some eyes fighting the good fight, but so sometimes to simplify is to actually be clear. And Mark Twain once was being criticized for a novel he was writing. It was over 500 pages long. And he said, I apologize, I didn't have time to make it shorter. So I will try to make Class 1 very brief. You might recall Class 1, we started out by talking about the crisis that exists in culture today. And how did we get there? That crisis affects what we call the dilemma of belief and believing as a believing Christian Catholic in today's environment. Key to that class was covering the intellectual history of about the last 700 or 800 years in 3 slides, which was unfair to those thinkers and to all of you. But to be as concise as I can be about that, in the medieval time, we had the highest aspirations for human reason to know things objectively, to know universal truth, being, goodness, beauty. And what we saw over time, starting in the 17th century, was a diminishing of reason, of its ability to know things in the cosmos or objective truth. And in exchange, through Descartes and David Hume and Immanuel Kant, all the way through to Hegel, we saw the aspirations of human reason being reduced, shriveled, withering to knowing really our own internal deductions and trying to get back to things, and they never made it. This is the failure of the Enlightenment project, namely to establish norms for society and the individual of what is good, what is just, apart from any appeals to God or Christian classical metaphysics. That project, as we saw, has failed. It failed with Friedrich Nietzsche, the prophet of nihilism, who sounded the bell of the hypocrisy of bourgeois Christianity and society. It continues on in the 20th century, and it continues on now with a hatred of human reason and any appeals to universal truth claims. And I mentioned to you, if you doubt that, just step on any college campus in the humanities department, and you will see all kinds of classes on how human reason is irrevocably refracted. It is undermined by race, class, sex, and any other category a person can get a research grant for. And so human reason as this objective capability of the human person to know what is good, true, beautiful, objectively, is long gone. And we charted that historically as ending around World War I. That was when the happy path of Enlightenment reason was not convincing to anyone. And all of the monsters that appeared on the stage in the 20th century, without restraints now of Enlightenment reason, were free to build the workers' paradises that characterized Eastern Europe for 70 years. So that's where we are. That's why there is a crisis in culture today, without roots, without foundations. That's our situation. So we said, how do we reclaim that? So we've had the reduction of human reason to know. We've had what is called the disenchantment of the cosmos. It's no longer designed for us. We know from astronomy the solar system we inhabit is not the center of the universe. So with the rise of the natural sciences, which is a good thing, the cosmos has been disenchanted. It has been reduced to an object of study for the sciences, for technology. It no longer points to a creator or what is good or the basis of order in society, as the Greeks thought it did. That brings us to today's classes, 2 through 5, on how do we reclaim culture. We know things are not what they should be. We know we're in crisis on fundamentals. How do we restore and reproclaim the good news of Jesus Christ? You know, a long time ago, I used to be a commercial banker. And I can remember one of my first clients, I was proud to get into the bank. We lended them a line of credit, $3 million, and they proceeded to go into bankruptcy. So I had to appear before the credit committee at the Northern Trust Company to sing for my supper and explain what happened. And we had a workout situation with this company. They manufactured bed frames, but they also had gotten into other product lines, mattresses and bedspreads, and all of that distracted their attention from what they did really well, which was manufacture bed frames from railroad ties. So part of the getting them out of bankruptcy was focusing on fundamentals. What do you do well? Simplify your business so you can meet next month's payroll. Something like that occurs when the church is in crisis too. We have to go back to the foundational truths of our faith and proclaim them loudly, even in a culture that doesn't acknowledge this. And so that's what classes 2 through 5 are going to be about. And what could be more fundamental than creation, the doctrine of creation, which, as I call it here, is a subversive theology in the ancient world in which it was proclaimed. And guess what? It is now subversive and revolutionary again today. So you recall in our journey now we are in class 2. Class 1 was how we lost our story, which I just explained, and now class 2 is on the doctrine of creation, regaining one of the foundational pillars of our faith. This book I will be drawing from for today's class, which was Cardinal Ratzinger, before he was Pope Benedict XVI in 1986. So he's the head of the doctrine for the Congregation of the Faith. He is now an Archbishop Cardinal, whereas that work we were reading from last week was 1968. He was a theologian. So you'll see he is much more pastoral in that he's going to be much more concrete than last week's work that we read. But more on this later. That date 1986 will be significant. So, with that, as I mentioned, the opening chapters of Genesis are a subversive revelation about monotheism, human origins, human destination, human destiny. This doctrine is a fundamental part of our faith. I kidded you last week, we don't hear many homilies anymore simply on the doctrine of creation anymore. And it consists of these elements. Creation in general. And I mentioned what creation does, properly understood, is it restores what I call verticality. Verticality is in contrast to just horizontal living of the here and now. That this earth is a small suburb in a larger universe of no significance. The study of the cosmos and of the earth is just the natural sciences, cause, effect, mechanistic explanations, horizontal. It offers us no norms by which we can approach the infinite or the transcendent. It's merely here and now, horizontal. The doctrine of creation, properly understood, restores what I call verticality, the transcendent. The creation of mankind we read in chapters 1 and 2 in Genesis. And as you know, or might recall, we have two accounts of the creation of man in Genesis. So much for Bible-only faiths. Sin and salvation, and then consequences for today. That will make up the components of what we cover. The last bullet point here is on interpretation. And do we read the Bible in general or the book of Genesis in particular the same way? Recall what I had mentioned to you before, maybe a year or two ago, about the Bible. The Bible is really not a book. The Bible is a library of several genres and books, letters, epic poetry, large-scale histories, the Psalms, and we're just still in the Old Testament. So keep that in mind, that you don't read the Bible and the books of the Bible with the same interpretive eye as you would other things. If you walk into the Lake Forest Library and you stroll into the poetry section, do you read that the same way you'd read the newspaper or a history of British Columbia? No, you have a different reading interpretive style based upon the type of literature that you are reading. Let me read to you a few passages from Pius XII on biblical interpretation. And this is from his letter Divino Afflante Spiritu, written in 1943. This is 1943. Quote, "What is the literal sense of a passage is not always as obvious in the speeches and writings of ancient authors of the East. The interpreter must, as it were, go back wholly in spirit to those remote centuries of the East, and with the aid of history, archaeology, and other sciences, accurately determine what modes of writing, so to speak, the authors of that ancient period would likely use, and in fact did use. For the ancient peoples of the East, in order to express their ideas, did not always employ those forms or kinds of speech which we use today, but rather those used by the men of their times and countries. What those exactly were, the commentator cannot determine, as it were, in advance, but only after careful examination of the ancient literature of the East." Continuing in another encyclical letter, Humani Generis, in 1951, Pope Pius XII writes, "This clearly points out that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, although properly speaking not conforming to the historical method used by the best Greek and Latin writers or by competent authors of our time, do nevertheless pertain to history in a true sense, which, however, must be further studied and determined by exegetes. The same chapters, in simple and metaphorical language, adapted to the mentality of a people but little cultured, both state the principal truths which are fundamental for our salvation and also give a popular description of the origin of the human race and the chosen people." Now note this, I emphasize this. If, however, the ancient sacred writers have taken anything from popular narrations, and this may be conceded, It must never be forgotten that they did so with the help of divine inspiration, through which they were rendered immune from any error in selecting and evaluating those documents. So, to put a crisp summary of that, we must distinguish between what the biblical authors are trying to convey as it relates to our salvation from the how they express themselves. And as I put here, the form is the how. So how they spoke in those days, how they wrote things down in those days, versus what are they trying to convey. We're obviously interested in both, but we are very interested in the what. What are they trying to tell us? Okay. This is a timeline of what most consensus scholars at the time Cardinal Ratzinger wrote that book in 1986, would place the writing, I get to use my red pointer. Let's see if I can do it. There we go. Can everyone see that? So in your handout, most scholars in the late 1980s, mid-90s, would locate the writing of the first 5 books of Genesis, certainly the first 2. Between this period of 732 BC and 586 AD, and probably a little past that. What is significant about those 2 dates is the 10 northern kingdoms of Israel were taken over and destroyed by the Assyrian nation. So all of the northern kingdoms were put into exile. And you remember the prophets of the north. So we go back to Elijah, but Jonah, who didn't want to be a prophet and actually wanted Nineveh to be destroyed, and God said after a while, no, I'll repent of the destruction. Amos and Hosea, who were constantly railing against the northern kings who were cheating the people, putting thumbs on the scale when they're measuring out grain. Hosea comparing Israel to an unfaithful whore versus God. It's where our imagery of God and Israel as a marriage, as nuptials, that theology starts there, in the infidelity of Israel to the covenant. It's where our Catholic theology of marriage also starts, as Christ's marriage to the church is symbolized by the yes of man and woman to each other. That theology starts here in Hosea. What happens then is the southern kingdom, Judah, falls in 586 to the Babylonians, who conquered the Assyrians. And you have all the wonderful southern prophets, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Daniel, who were hauled away in that conquest and taken away. And it would take a good 50 years. There were 3 deportations, 3 returns. It would take Cyrus and his successors, Darius, Xerxes, to restore and give religious liberty back to the people of Israel. But my point in all this is that this time frame was the consensus view of scriptural scholars of when Genesis certainly was all collected. It refers to traditions that are going to go back a millennium, but in terms of codifying it in a book called Genesis, it was thought to be around this time frame. Scholars today more and more question that, we don't have to dwell on that too much, but it is relevant to our thoughts tonight and what Pope Benedict will have to say about this. But most scholars still think it's happening as a result of the exile of the people. They are now thrown out of the land which was promised to them by God. What's happening? So, as I mentioned here, the writers of Genesis, when they're gathering all this material, are shaping their narrative in the context of being tossed out of their land by the Babylonians. And all of the polytheistic cults of the Babylonians are in play. So we could have gone back to Amos and even Hosea, those prophets, where they're constantly rallying against the people of Israel about why are you going to these temples where these Babylonian gods are. Why are you eating the raisin cakes? Why are you doing incense? And the prostitution that occurred in those temples. That's the context of when Genesis is being pulled together. The dominant story, the Genesis story for the Babylonian religion, was discovered in 1849 on 7 tablets called the Enuma Elish, or Enuma Elisha. These are thought to have been created in 1100 BC. They refer to stories and events that are also on other statuary and pillars from 1800 BC. So the stories of the Babylonian god Marduk, who emerges out of this polytheistic contest for who's going to be top dog, is what's surrounding the culture of Israel when they're writing and collecting the book of Genesis. And the stories are interesting, and you can actually read them in about 15 to 20 minutes. And it describes the clash of these different gods of Babylonian origin fighting each other for supremacy. One of them is a dragon god who is cut in half, and his blood is used to create the human race. Heaven and earth emerge out of the split body, and the blood of this deadly, monstrous dragon is used to create human beings as well. As the Pope notes, something ominous is in this Babylonian creation myth, that there's something already awry with the earth and human nature, created from the blood of a dead dragon. Only the king of Babylon can restore and unite what has been dispersed widely in all of these different ways. Thus, the intractable problem and conflict between Babylon and Israel. Israel could not accept the polytheistic gods, and Babylon certainly was not going to accept the God of Israel, because that God is Marduk. There could be no compromise. This is why they destroyed all the temples in the northern kingdom and also in Jerusalem. We could look at and we'll do this briefly, but Hesiod wrote a work. He wrote 2 works that we know of, but one, the Theogony. This is where we get our Clash of the Titans stories of the Greek gods. And some of you have seen this before. A couple of years ago, we spent a little time on this. But you have this bloodline of this blood genealogy of the Greek gods, starting with Uranus and Gaia. And there's a conflict, and children are threatening. And as I mentioned here, Gaia, the wife of Uranus, with the help of her son Kronos, overthrows Uranus. Kronos, recalling his mother's treachery against Uranus, who seeks to eat all his children because he remembers what happened, is fooled so that Zeus is hidden away from him so he doesn't kill him. His wife gives him a boulder wrapped in a blanket to eat, which he does, thinking he's killed Zeus, but Zeus is hidden. On and on. There are many off-shooting stories. How did Aphrodite come about? How did Athena come from the mind of Zeus? And so forth, which we won't spend time on. But the point I'm making here is that creation in these pagan cultures is polytheistic. The gods are whimsical. They deal with humans haphazardly and often with cruelty. And they're an afterthought. They're part of a polytheistic creation contest. Man is a plaything of the gods, without purpose, without destiny. This is the context of the writers and editors of Genesis collecting the stories that we have in the opening chapters of Genesis. So at the top of this page, most scholars, not all, as I mentioned, think that Genesis is written sometime in that 7th, 6th century BC. Why wasn't it written, the question might be, when, for example, King David was at the height of his power? Why wouldn't they write Genesis then? Or Joshua, why didn't he write Genesis? Or why don't we think there was some person at the elbow of God while he was creating the first 6 days? By the way, God created the sun and the moon in the fourth day, so how could there be 3 prior days? Just a thought. Again, so much for Bible only. So it was only through desolation and defeat, as I mentioned here, and the Pope develops this idea, that the Jewish people, the Israelites, thought we have to understand our history in a deeper way because we've just been kicked out of the land that was promised to Abraham. Moses liberates us from Egypt to get to the land. What's happening? In crisis, in destruction, in exile, in spiritual abandonment, the concept is that's when these books were put together to explain human origins. And what did God's promises actually mean for all this time to us? So the prophets in misery reveal this new face of God that is not now limited to the land, which has now been lost, but to something deeper, to something else. To recall core truths of human origin and the creation of the universe. Thus you see Genesis becomes this subversive, revolutionary document waved in the face of conquerors that our God is the God of all. And this has become clear to us in our misery because we've lost the land. So as I put here, because Israel had become godless with land, they had abandoned the covenant in both the north and southern kingdoms. God had sent many prophets to them. Please reform your lives. Please stop going to the temple prostitutes. Stop eating those raisin cakes. Stop doing incense to those idols. Stop cheating in the marketplace. And they were ignored. Jeremiah, who we saw, was thrown down a well. They were ignored by the kings of Israel. So, God makes them land. They were godless with land. God makes them landless. Unlike the other triumphant warrior gods, to show that his dominion is going to be of a spiritual nature and of a total, universal nature. And it deepens and recasts the covenant promise that was made to Abraham. So as the Pope develops this, what are the headlines from the first chapter of Genesis, which that creation account actually ends in the second chapter by the 3rd verse? This was revolutionary in its time. If you were a Greek or a Babylonian or what was left of the Assyrians, this would have been jarring to you. And as I mentioned, it would have a certain arrogance to it. You might recall I was talking about the arrogance of our claim that Jesus Christ is the unique mediator in history between God and man, and that under no other name are we saved. This would have the same jarring effect of all of the hundreds of gods that were worshipped in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia. The faith of the Israelites is there's one God who has power over all and who created everything from nothing. Monotheism. One God creates all things, and it was good. There was no primordial evil or split body of something evil by which God created. God created through his word, through the logos, which is Greek for word or reason. It's where our word logic comes from. So God's mind creates. But it's more than that. Creation is not just some thing that God created almost by accident. If God is perfect and infinite and needs nothing outside of himself, the fact that he created means that he wanted to, because we're not necessary. The universe is not necessary, as much as Stephen Hawking might think it is with the multiverse theory, which is akin to the fables of Marduk, something from nothing. The universe is not necessary. Any mechanism an astrophysicist appeals to, whether it's quantum fluctuations in a vacuum that spurs out multiverses. He's referring to a mechanism. We can naturally ask the question, what launched the mechanism? There's this ongoing deferral of explanation. So it turns out it's no explanation at all. It gets you no closer to an answer about the being of the universe than the Enuma Elish. Just different categories of thought being used. One, a mathematical description of the universe, another, a mythological one. And if you want to count years, the Babylonian mythological one lasted 1,500 years. How long do you think the multiverse theory is going to last? 1,500 years? So we're not necessary. Creation is not necessary. So if we exist, God intended to create us. We're not an afterthought. Next, creation is rational, meaning nature acts for ends that it has by nature. There are causes, there are effects. If you are working out and running, you start to perspire. Your body seeks to cool itself down. Your respiration goes up. You get more oxygen and blood flowing. Nature acts for ends. We see purpose in nature. There are so many conditions necessary, millions, for you to even see. There are millions of conditions for hydrogen and helium to form, and they did. The universe has a signature to it that it was almost designed for us because it is so improbable. So creation is rational. It's not the result of some polytheistic contest. Again, this would be very jarring and odd to the culture of the time, and it's very jarring and odd, these claims, to our culture today. I mention here this restores verticality. The cosmos and morality are united. What do I mean by that? The Greeks were able to touch this with Plato and his reflections on the universal good, the truth, the work he wrote, The Republic, on justice. There's always this direct linkage between cosmos and society and morality in Greek thought. They touch this. In Genesis, it's proclaimed loudly. I mentioned last class, metaphysical lives matter. But it's true. And it happens to be a very jarring revolutionary claim for today, that the cosmos is pregnant with universality, spirituality, and truth, but of a monotheistic kind, not a Pilates kind. Lastly, unique to Genesis in this sense, creation culminates on the seventh day. God rests, the Sabbath day. Creation is meant for worship of this personal God who created a rational universe and that he intended it for us. So knit into the structure of Genesis is not just your typical creation myth, but that it actually culminates creation in the Sabbath, in worship of this monotheistic God. And thus we see the beautiful parallel in John's Gospel, which mirrors the beginning of Genesis. So God creates in Genesis through the Word. God said, "Let there be light." He said, "Lux fiat, let there be light." So too, John starts his Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things were created through him, and without him nothing was in existence, and so forth. This parallel finds its culmination in the new creation, the capstone of creation of Jesus Christ. Just an interesting parallel. And we will develop this more in class 3 when we talk about the liturgy and worship. So if we were to read chapter 2, that's where we have the story of Adam being created out of the dust of the ground and God breathing into him and pulling a rib out of him to make Eve. This starts in chapter 2, goes through a good section of chapter 2. You can tell by my question here, what does it actually mean to be a human being? It's a foundational question we're talking about. And it's at risk again today, which we'll get to in a moment. But what Genesis is telling us is, what does it mean to be a human being today and back then? And this, again, would have been quite jarring to the Babylonian, Greek, and Assyrian faiths of the time, and it would be quite jarring on college campuses today or in political programs and slogans. So man was formed from the dust of the earth. What comes out of that? Man is not God and did not create the universe. Man is not some fallen angel. He's not a derivative being. And as I mentioned here and have stated already, he's not part of some contest as a side outcome. He's not a simple doormat for the gods. In fact, as St. John Paul II often said, man is the only creature God created for his own sake. Man is an end in himself. Man is the reason God created. Man is the steward of creation, and he has responsibilities toward it. But creation is for man. And as we saw on the prior slide, in fact, creation is for worship, the Sabbath. We see in the next passage, and God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Pope says, at this phase, the divine image enters. And we know this from our catechism. At the moment of creation of a human person, the soul is created directly by God. It's not something that can come from below. It only can come from above. It is in this sense that we are created in the image and likeness of God, in our rationality, because we know God is rational, and in our ability to have free choice, our ability to love, our ability to say yes and no. But it's more than that. An image points beyond itself, as Pope Benedict will write, that there's an essential relationality. We are made for relationship. We are not an island. Human beings flourish in relationship with others. Humanity is en route, in transit, essentially. We're not like a water molecule, H2O, static, has properties, can be steam, can be ice, can be water, can be analyzed, can be broken down, reduced to its chemical constituents. Human beings are not like that. We have this image of God in us, of rationality and the ability to love freely, not by instinct, like the animals do. And we are open to the future. And, as St. Augustine said, we have memories of the past. So we are en route by nature. We are social by nature, unlike any other thing on the planet. That makes us special. So that's why we have this wonderful origin, God, intended by God, and we have this wonderful destiny, God. This is the source of our dignity. We have no dignity in any other sense. You see how if regimes of the 20th century believe this, or go back to the 19th century, or back to the slave trade, or back 1,000 years to rampant slavery across the globe, people weren't treated equally, with equal dignity. They were not seen as being created in the image and likeness of God. So you see how radical this has always been and is today. Lastly, we image God as male and female. This would have been rejected out of court in the Babylonian times, Greek times, when this was collected. And yet Genesis makes this bold statement that as men and women, we image God. And God is fully imaged in our different sexes. Also in our body and soul. We were created in matter, and God breathed life into us. So not only do we image God in our different sexes, male and female, but we image God as a body-soul composite. I am as much the soul of my body as I am the body of my soul. No dualism. No reduction of the human body to mere means to achieve spiritual goals. You begin to see how the human body, just as the cosmos, can be a source of moral norms when taken together with the soul. It's the basis of our Catholic theology in many ways. Natural law theory takes seriously that the human person is a body-soul composite. There'd be a lot to unpack there, but it starts here in Genesis. We'll try to get to applications of this a little bit later. You remember the phrase, this is just a passing comment, but when Adam says after Eve is created, "At last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh," that strikes us as something nice and wonderful and pious. It was actually a very revolutionary statement of the time. Why? Because the human person in the other stories of the other pagan religions was created from, blood, a dead dragon, impersonal forces, not the touch of God. So these little tells, anyone plays poker, you know what a tell is. So they always scratch their ear when they're going to bet when they have nothing. This is a tell. The Genesis writer is recalling something from the past to proclaim something to the polytheism of the time, that man is special, that a woman is special. Bone of my bone. We're human beings intended, loved into existence. We're not some whimsical chance event, and our bodies don't matter, and we can change them. You see what's at stake here right at the beginning? It informs our Catholic understanding. It informs our position on heterosexual marriage. It informs our positions on how to face people who struggle with same-sex attractions or gender difficulties. It starts here. It's not made up later to marginalize people. It's a core aspect of our faith, and it starts here. Continuing, sin and salvation is also part of the doctrine of creation. It's at this stage in the book that I pointed to earlier that the Pope mentions that as the cardinal prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he would meet with bishop conferences throughout the year. And he recalls a meeting he had with all of the bishops from Africa and the cardinals from Africa. And those bishops were telling Cardinal Ratzinger, Western preaching reminds us of when we come in during the middle of a movie or of a piece of music. We just hear all about the kind of the soft soap talk, but no one ever talks about sin and the need for salvation. We feel like we're coming in the middle of a movie when we listen to Western preaching. And they had a chuckle about it, that in Africa they know what's at stake because they had to come out of a culture that was polytheistic already. There's no value proposition to Catholicism if you don't include in the doctrine of creation sin and salvation. There's no draw. So with that, the story of the fall in Genesis, the Pope continues to reflect on, is when Israel is in crisis as well, and is recalling the original stories of Adam and Eve in its tradition, in its culture, and also using manners of expression that would have been impactful at the time. The use of the serpent, which was a symbol of fertility and of evil. So the dialogue between the serpent and Eve would have been meaningful and relevant to the people of that culture. But more deeply, and this is where the Pope, in tying the stories of Genesis to the history of Israel, are so interesting. Think of it this way. As the people of Israel are being led out in chains in exile, you can almost imagine the jeering that they got from the people now occupying their condos, from the balconies. Get out of here. A long train of people in chains. 2/3 of them would die just traveling by foot. You can maybe things being thrown at them, being jeered at, and I took some poetic license here, but you can imagine them saying, your God is far away. Why do you worship this distant God of a grueling covenant? Think of all the ritual requirements, the 10 Commandments, grueling rules. You are losing the land he promised you. Free yourself from these limitations. Why are you worshiping one God? If you worship Marduk, you can stay. Embrace the freedom and ecstasy of the here and now that is divine. These are the slogans we would hear today in any seminar on human fulfillment. The temptation of Adam and Eve, our first parents, reflects this temptation as well that the people of Israel all felt to what I say fall in line. Fall in line with the Babylonian gods, with Marduk. Can't you join us? Really? Genesis also reveals God's intention for us. How? Well, first of all, we're created out of what is good. We fell later. Creation was created good. Again, very jarring to the polytheistic religions of the time, where creation comes out of conflict, of a fight, of battle. No, God creates, and it was good. God is the author of all things. Adam and Eve were good prior to their act of disobedience. Evil comes from without, the serpent, but also from the pride and sin of disobedience of Adam and Eve, from within. The serpent appealed to something within us, and they disobeyed. And as the Pope calls it, the essence of sin is this exaggerated sense of our own self-sufficiency, that I can pull myself up by my own ears, that I don't need to be dependent on God. As John Milton, the poet, wrote, I'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. I'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. We want our self-sufficiency decoupled from dependency on something outside of us. Sound familiar? So this disorder that now has been unleashed by this act of disobedience affects us and affects all of creation. This disorder concretely means, as we know from the Catechism, our minds are darkened and our wills are weak. Concupiscence. We don't choose what we ought. We are ignorant, sometimes self-imposed ignorance, but we muddle through now. The supremacy we sought has recoiled on us, and we've found out we're not running things. In fact, some scholars reflect on the pain of sin is pain in childbirth for women. So the puffed up pride and rationality of our head as it goes through the birth canal will now cause pain concretely in the birth of every human person. So we puff ourselves up, we destroy ourselves. The covenant, then, in the Old Testament will be God's continual offer to restore us to friendship with God, which again would be quite revolutionary. That God seeks a personal friendship with us through the Old Testament covenant. Clearly in the New Testament, Jesus is the new covenant who seeks to call us sons and daughters. Family, Abba, Father. How should you pray? Our Father, the family of God, children of God. This continual offer in the Old and New Testament to restore what was lost in the fall. God seeks us out. When we sinned, we hid. Adam and Eve hid after they sinned, you might recall. God still seeks us out. Where are you? That would not be a polytheistic thought in the early ancient myths, because those gods required worship to placate them. It wasn't to achieve any kind of friendship as much as to placate the gods anxiously. So with this, I've thrown a lot at you. This is the last slide, so feel good about that. But I also want to give us time for questions. But I now want to apply what I've just covered, and this will prompt, hopefully, some questions. Because you might be saying, Charles, this has been very poetical, but how does this touch ground with the culture today? And I've hinted at that as I've gone, but now let's be very concrete. Because you might be asking, where is the polytheism today? We don't see people on Sunday mornings with mats and other accoutrements worshiping on their knees, do we? So where does the tension lie today? That was an attempt at dry humor, if you think of the Pilates studios all over the place. So sorry about that. Okay. So let's just go panel to panel. The revolution of Genesis, ancient and today. God is one. One God. And he creates everything through his word, implying an order, standards, in accordance with his will. Things move and happen because of God's will. What do we see in the culture? We see, and again, I hate to pick on Stephen Hawking, he just passed away. Rest in peace, right? But his book was very popular on the multiverse, The Theory of Everything. Very popular. If you look on Amazon, highly read. That quantum fluctuations in a vacuum prior to the Big Bang can generate multiverses. Infinite number of multiverses. Something from nothing. And even if that mechanism is true, he has not explained the origin of the universe. He's just explained another step in that process. And yet it's celebrated as worthy, enlightened, sophisticated, and it's taught as actually a philosophical theory. So right away, the multiverse is a kind of polytheism. Think about that for a moment, and I call it the magic of Marduk. It's just as credible. It's just as much an explanation of the being of the universe as Stephen Hawking. Creation, as an artifact of God, reveals his word, his reason and purpose in things. The act of creation relates God, cosmos, worship, seventh day, morality. This is that verticality I'm talking about. Creation is related to worship, which is related to morality, and it creates this vertical, transcendental dimension to our experience of God and the cosmos. For secular culture, the cosmos is the sum total of all of the mechanical causes we can identify. Forces of gravity, dark energy, dark matter, black holes. The mathematical descriptions of the universe are the true, deepest ones, after all. So appeals to metaphysics in the classical sense, or religion, even more embarrassing, to explain the being of the universe is not needed. It's superfluous and anti-intellectual. Is this now connecting with our current discourse on the conflict between faith and science? This is where it's coming from. This next one, I know sounds obvious to us. It is not obvious to our culture. Man is not God. He is created in the image and likeness of God, body, soul, in order to worship and have a real friendship with God. And as I stated earlier, man is the only creature God willed for its own sake. A divine origin and destiny. That is the source of our dignity. That is the source of our infinite value. That's why we can't be reduced to something disposable for the sake of some greater good. This is the origin of the right to life, truth claim in morals. It is never justified to directly intend and take the life of an innocent person. Why? It's not obvious. You say, oh, Charles, of course it is obvious. And I would say, throughout the span of history, it was not obvious. It is revolutionary to make this claim. Then and now. The source of our dignity is God, in our origin and in our destiny. That's why the human person has infinite value. What's the discourse for today's society? I am God. It's not said in so many words. It's more said that I construct through my own free choices my life project. It's not tethered to anything outside of me. And in fact, if you were to impose something on me from the outside, it would limit my freedom. So, many people who are in this frame of mind have a unstated, unexpressed philosophy of life, of the sovereign self. I am Joe, the boss of my own body, mind, heart, soul. I am the landlord of my life. I own it. Whereas as Catholics, as Christians, we're the tenant of our life. God has given us a gift of life, which we have for a while, and He asks us, what are you going to do with what I gave you? You're a tenant of your life. You're not the landlord of your life. This runs very counter to our culture today. And as I put in bold there, you can almost hear the devil whispering this to our first parents, or the Babylonians throwing it down on the people of Israel as they're led out in chains. You shall be like God. You shall be your own standard. Join us. You are the measure of your own good, your own virtue, your own truth. Walk a mile in my sandals. You've heard that. The relativism that pervades our culture comes from this idea of the sovereign self. You are your own standard. There are no universal standards that we could glean from studying human nature or the cosmos or classical metaphysics. You are your own standard. The ancient polytheisms go hand in hand with dualism. And by dualism, I mean you are a spirit. You are a ghost in a machine of the human body. Your true self is a spiritual self. This was rejected by the people of Israel in Genesis. God is one, and human nature is this image of God in its fullness, as male and female, and as a body-soul composite. But in our culture, as I just said, my spiritual self is my true self. My body, my sex, fertility are derivative. They're provisional. They're a means to my true self achieving its purposes. As I call it, the liquid self. We are living through right now the reduction of the human person to these base appetites, whether it's LGBTQ, A, B, C, D, E. What is going on there? The fragmentation of the person, the polytheism under another name, the liquid self. You can be whatever you want to be. No constraints. You're the landlord of your life. Your true self is your spiritual self. Your body is just simply something you can put on, take off like a jacket, to express your true self. You see the hidden philosophy behind that, the hidden theology behind that, of this dualism and polytheism that is going on, that we just thought happened in ancient times when they worshiped rocks and trees and statues. That's not us. We're enlightened today, right? We're doing the same thing. Our culture is doing the same thing. We're not creating images and rocks. The self has become the base of this polytheism. The other way this shows up in culture is earth worship. If we have time, we can get to that one. But worship of the earth, as man is for the earth. And in fact, human beings are part of the problem. What's wrong with this planet? Well, human beings are part of the problem. You see what's happening? We've gone from creation was for man, and man is a steward of creation with responsibilities for creation, to man is a microbe, a germ on the planet Earth. Human reason is the enemy. Technology, sciences, knowledge alienate us from Gaia. Gaia, there are Gaia societies, as some of you know, Earth societies. So what I'm trying to do is connect dots for you of what's happening in our culture, particularly in the West. It's happening all around us. This next one touches on what I talked about earlier. We are by nature a social animal. And this is where a critique could be made of libertarian economic theories as well as socialism. But what I'm getting at is society and man as a social animal is not a construct of governments or states. Rather, it is in the nature of man to be social, to form societies. The first one being the family. So where libertarian ideologies break down is you as a baby could not care for yourself. You relied on your family, your parents, whomever. You might say, what does that have to do with the critique of libertarian economics? A lot. Because we have obligations to each other that stem from being human. Where we differ is, what is that list? Is it a long list? Is it a short list? Does it include a right to advanced healthcare procedures? Does it include a right to a glass of water if I'm dying of thirst? So there's a big difference. But man is by nature social. So we reject the Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, these are philosophers and political scientists who form the basis of conservative economic policy that is godless. One of the critiques Karl Marx made of John Locke and John Milton was, these are just British property owners trying to protect their interests. There's nothing inherent in what they're saying, and that's about the only thing Karl Marx got right. They didn't appeal to nature. They didn't appeal to metaphysics. They didn't appeal to Christianity. They just appealed to man's desire to form society through free associations, which we believe in some general sense. But as the basis for society, we do not as Christians. So Karl Marx correctly said, they're knitting their own funeral shroud. This will not last. Now, Karl Marx got about everything else wrong. He wrote a book, Das Kapital an Kapital, and he, of course, was a leech off of his friend Friedrich Engels, and Karl Marx's mother once said, he talks a lot about capital, I wish he would go out and earn some. The last one. As a result of the fall, man is estranged from God. We are not naturally friends with God. We need grace. So we are estranged with God, with ourselves, and at war with others. And in the wonderful saying of St. Paul, the good I will, I don't do, and the evil I do not will, I do. This conflict that St. Paul notes is in us every day. We labor under it. We struggle under this burden from original sin, the disobedience of our first parents. This is what the fall has wrought. But as we say with St. Paul, felix culpa, this happy fault of Adam merited for us so great a Redeemer. Grace abounds more. So we can cheer up. We have the possibility of real friendship with God restored through Jesus Christ. What was broken can be repaired. What is redemption, small r, in our culture? Well, first of all, good and evil are medieval terms from the past. They're kind of ugly terms that we shouldn't use at cocktail parties. And it's more, are you consistent with your life project? You know, if you want to become a medical doctor and you don't study, well, we can criticize that. We can make kind of aesthetic judgments. But we can't make any inherent judgments about good and evil, capital G, capital E. I heard a lecture once, a debate between Judge Richard Posner and Cardinal George, probably 15 years ago, on the nature of good and evil. Was one of the topics. And Judge Posner said, a Jewish man, what happened in Germany in the death camps was not inherently evil. It was wrong from an aesthetic point of view, but not inherently evil, because there's no such thing as something being inherently evil or good. There's merely preferences. Bad outcomes for some people, certainly we can say that aesthetically. It's better to live than to die, obviously. But there's nothing inherently right or wrong about anything. Just, do I like the outcome or not? Do I like French vanilla ice cream versus double fudge chocolate? The answer is double fudge chocolate. But for me to say, it's evil that you don't like French vanilla, you'd say, well, Charles, that's just your taste. That's just your choice. But don't get bent out of shape about it, right? Or if I violate a speed limit, 55 miles an hour, say I go 65, do I have pangs of conscience when I'm at home thinking I broke a speed limit law? No. Why do I not? Or none of us in this room, hopefully. Because there's nothing inherent in the speed limit law. It just is positive law. It's posited by the state of Illinois if I'm on the tollway. You see what I'm getting at? There's nothing inherent in good and evil. There's nothing inherent in our laws. That's why they can be changed according to our secular ideology. But you see that in this second panel here at the bottom, we're left with the self and its projects and its appetites, and we aggrandize them in our culture. With the caveat in small text, typically, as long as I'm not hurting someone else, right? I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not ... hurting someone else. And of course, I get to define what someone else is and means, right? Isn't that handy? A nice plastic definition. So, The polytheism of the ancient world, which we think is done and over with and in the past, is back. It's back in the fragmentation of the self, in society without foundations, chasing itself, the self and its appetites, beyond good and evil. And we're reaping the whirlwind. I am legion, for we are many. So this is the revolution of Genesis. This is the revolution of the doctrine of creation. Do you see how what's old is what's new? Do you see how Genesis today, properly understood, is as revolutionary as it was when the people of Israel constructed and pulled it together? And what's interesting about this is, in some scholars' opinions, it was precisely when it was written in crisis. And you can see why. In crisis, we rediscover foundations. We rediscover what's fundamental. And so you see Pope Benedict, in the works that he has written that we'll cover through the rest of the course of the classes 3, 4, and 5, he's attempting to put the bricks back into the foundation. That's what his priorities were. To create a community, once again, built on truth and love. And we start with the core doctrines of our faith. So next week we will cover the liturgy, the Mass. What does it mean? What are we doing when we attend Mass? As another one of those building blocks of reclaiming and restoring culture and proclaiming it to others. As I mentioned to you before, and this is my plug again for RCIA, coming up in fall of 2018, the most common thing I hear from candidates who go through with huge smiles on their faces is, Charles, no one ever told me this before. If you read books of converts, evangelical converts to Catholicism, Surprised by Joy, I believe that's one of the titles. Evangelicals who know the Bible backwards and forwards, can quote passages incredibly. When they're presented Catholic material, faithfully, honestly, no one ever told me this before. Never heard this before. So that's why we go back to foundations. We draw from that well, from that resource, that overflowing sprinkler of God's grace, God's truth, and God's love. So that's what we're about in this course and what we'll cover in classes 3 on the Mass. Class 4 is on the church, the society of truth and love. Class 5, which we wrap up with, will be on death and the afterlife. Death as a passage to full friendship with God, which has already started now. These are the core elements of our faith. So with that, are there any questions before we wrap up? Yes. So I would say this, that the type of crisis we're facing now is an ancient one that has come back, unlike a crisis, say, of the 19th century, of, say, the social question or the social teaching of the church, where the crisis was not about the nature of Christianity. It was maybe some particular doctrine in social Catholic thought, or maybe a crisis on some theological point like, are Anglican orders valid or not? And Pope Leo in the 19th century said, no, they're not. That's not a crisis of the core or of the foundation. What we're experiencing now is a fundamental crisis. And that's why the ancient paradigms are relevant today. All the time I spent reading Greek and Latin authors 30 years ago is finally paying off. Because the nature of the crisis today is one of, as I mentioned in class 1, to believe or not to believe. Not to, should I be a Presbyterian or a Methodist? That's not a crisis, that's just, what are the tea times? I'm sorry, that was a terrible joke, I'm sorry. But I apologize to the YouTube audience on that one, but I couldn't resist. It's the end of the class. I'm a little warm. But we have a crisis of foundations today of to believe or not to believe at all. First, just a conceptual point. There's really no such thing as a relativist. Because the next time you face a relativist who thinks everything is just from your point of view, you ask them, do they hold that position absolutely or relatively? and so that falls apart. If they're honest intellectually, they would realize that's a silly thing to think and hold to. So everyone actually has absolutes. Everyone does. It's just how they disguise and talk about it. I'm broad-minded. I'm willing to entertain open marriage. My spouse and I, we can have multiple partners, and that's a position. That's a philosophy of life. And they hold it, absolutely. So the argument of, well, you hold absolute positions, therefore you should be dismissed from the conversation, is already coming from an absolutist posture. So the question isn't, are you an absolutist or not, is what are the propositions you hold to? And are they credible? Are they valid? Are they life-giving? Do they promote human flourishing? Then, if the person is still there, then you can start to, the term is unpack their positions and what's their real agenda. Yes, and you hear the slogans of, be the best version of yourself, right? We've all heard that, right? And it sounds wonderful. Be the best version of yourself. That I have many versions of myself that would land me in jail. Right. The best ones especially, right. So these cottage cheese, fluffy slogans are simply designed to shut the conscience off. Right. Last question. I don't want to keep you over time. Anyone? In the back. That is a good question. We covered that in the catechism last year, if you remember. But as to the view that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that was actually the dominant Catholic view as well for 1700 years, until they started digging up manuscripts in the Middle East. And when they started digging up archaeology and archaeological finds in the Middle East, and began to compare that literature with Genesis and the time frames narrated in Genesis and what they began to see in the ground archaeologically and historically. So I would say that is probably that view that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament is probably a 5% view of scholars who study the Old Testament. And the main consensus is that material could have been pulled from the time of Moses, certainly, and even well past that, collated, collected, edited much, much later. And as I mentioned on that timeline, the consensus opinion has moved more toward the 5th century BC, when this material was pulled together in its full form. So as scholars look at more manuscripts, and we dig up more statues and pillars and columns, more of the consensus view is moving it more toward the 5th century, 4th century BC. Well, good. Well, with that, thank you. I hope to see you next week. All right.